Good day, everyone. So first, let me introduce myself. I am Johanna May Hanuto. And we will be discussing about the chapter 4, which is the teaching effectively in a multi-grade classroom. So, once you start teaching in a multi-grade classroom, how effective your teaching will largely depend on how you are well prepared to handle multiple activities. The goal is to create a diverse instructional strategies with both suitable to the curriculum content and based on the needs of your students. Management of teaching calls for you to strategically plan activities to engage the student through direct teaching with a peer tutor in a small group or in independent study. As noted above, every child comes to the school with the potential to learn but also with a unique personality and set of needs and abilities. This means that you need to develop and implement teaching strategies that will enable you to address the needs of each child linked to his or her age, maturity, interests, and capabilities. It will take time to get to know each of your students, but you can begin by trying to make your multi-grade classroom inclusive and conducive to learning for each child and group. At this moment, let's proceed to Lesson 1, the adapting of the curriculum and lesson plans. So, as a future educator, may I ask you, why should we adapt the curriculum and lesson plan in a multi-grade class? But before that, our objectives for this lesson is to, first, identify useful suggestions on redesigning the curriculum to suit multi-grade situations. Second is to explain the different stages of lesson planning. And last, write a lesson plan for a multi-grade class. Now, let's proceed to useful suggestions for designing the curriculum. So, useful suggestions includes, first is you have to group them strategically. For some activities, divide your students into mixed ability groups. This will encourage students of different backgrounds to include each other in their work. You may then want to group students by age or grade for skill subjects such as in reading, writing, arithmetic, and science. Next is prepare flexible and appropriate materials. For grouping to be effective, materials and teaching must be varied and made challenging to accommodate the learning needs of students with different levels of ability. Develop a variety of worksheets to be used with diverse groups in multi-grade classroom situations. This could include the teacher-guided activity sheets, group learning worksheets, individual practice worksheets, and peer-directed instruction sheets. Another is promote self-paced learning. So while helping students to perform activities together, at the same time, ensure that they are allowed to move through the curriculum at their own pace. This should help them to achieve the set learning objectives for each grades in the curriculum. Next is give extra attention to children with special education needs. So ensure that students with disabilities, learning difficulties, and other needs can achieve milestones as others do. So you may need to include special preparation in terms of separate worksheets and more individual attention depending on the nature and degree of their special education needs. Revisiting and redesigning the national curriculum to suit multi-grade situations according to the number of classes to be combined together is essential for teaching the required curriculum content in a phased and continuous manner and for making it appropriate to the cultural and social economic context of your school. So to do this, you may find these suggestions useful. First is select common themes from one subject suitable for all the grades in your multi-grade classroom. Next is develop a flexible timetable for all the grades throughout the session of this theme. Another is develop daily lesson plan for each unit related to this theme with the help of textbook and reference materials as per the curriculum. Next is select activities linked to the curriculum that are to be conducted in the class. Also, develop relevant worksheets for individual or group practice. And relate concepts from the curriculum to examples from your students' daily lives. Also, prepare quizzes to assess your students' mastery of the curriculum content. And last, nurture talent in the school by organizing related co-curricular activities such as music, creative arts, games, and physical education. Now, in a multi-grade classroom, the curriculum is best delivered in an integrated sequence of learning activities. To begin, you can concentrate on a theme, not individual subjects or grade levels. This becomes the focus for all learning activities for the whole class. You can add to the effectiveness of the integrated unit by linking to it as many different learning areas as possible. You need to take time to become thoroughly familiar with the content materials for each theme. Work with students interested in a particular topic to explore this as it facilitates their and your learning. It is also important that you are systematic in planning lesson plans and developing teaching and learning materials relevant to each of the curriculum units.
Good morning, class. I am teacher Christy Jane T. Masacote, and for now I will discuss the topic which is all about the stages of lesson planning. So class, what is lesson planning? Lesson planning is the activity which the teacher performs before the actual lesson takes place. A lesson plan serves as a guide that a teacher uses every day to determine what the students will learn, how the lesson will be taught, as well as how learning will be evaluated. Lesson plans enable teachers to function more effectively in the classroom by giving a detailed outline that they adhere during each class. What is a lesson plan? A lesson plan is a detailed description of the instructional strategies and learning activities to be performed during the teaching and learning process. A lesson plan is the instructor's roadmap of what students need to learn and how it will be done effectively during class time. Then, you can design appropriate learning activities and develop strategies to obtain feedback on student learning. A successful lesson plan addresses and integrates three key components, which are learning objectives, learning activities, and assessments to check for students' understanding. Fact: a productive lesson plan is not one in which everything goes exactly as planned, but one in which both students and instructor learn from each other. And now, let's talk about the stages of lesson planning. The stages of lesson planning has 3 stages, which are the lesson planning before the lesson or before the class, lesson planning during the lesson or during the class, and lesson planning after the lesson or after the class. Lesson planning before the lesson or before the class. It is the activities before the lesson include developing lesson plan itself, deciding on the methods of presentation, selecting the text, and preparing the materials or worksheets to be used during the lesson and assignment task. There are 6 steps for preparing your lesson plan before your class, which are: identify the learning objectives, plan the specific learning activities, plan to assess students' understanding, plan to sequence the lesson in an engaging and meaningful manner, and create a realistic timeline, and 6. Plan for a lesson closure. The first step is to identify the learning objectives. Before you plan your lesson, you will first need to identify the learning objectives for the lesson. A learning objectives describe what the learner will know or be able to do after the learning experience rather than what the learner will be exposed to during the instruction. Typically, learning objectives, it is written in a language that is easily understood by students and clearly related to the program learning outcomes. The characteristics of clear learning objectives, it is clearly stated task, give an important learning goals, it is achievable, demonstrable and measurable, fair and equitable, linked to course and program objectives. Identifying learning objectives is under and stated in the Bloom's Revised Taxonomy of Educational Objectives, which is useful resource for crafting learning objectives that are demonstrable and measurable. The second step, plan the specific learning activity. When planning learning activities, you should consider the types of activities students will need to engage in order to develop the skills and knowledge required to demonstrate effective learning in the course. It should be directly related to the learning objectives of the course and provide experiences that will enable students to engage in, practice, and gain feedback on specific progress towards those objectives. As you plan your learning objectives, you have to estimate how much time you will spend on each. Build in time for extended explanation or discussion, but also be prepared to move on quickly to different applications or problems, and to identify strategies that check for understanding. Some questions to think about as you design the learning activities you will use are: what will I do to explain the topic? What will I do to illustrate the topic in a different way? How can I engage students in the topic? What are some real-life examples, analogies, or situations that can help students understand the topic? And what will students need to do help them understand the topic better? Many activities can be used to engage learners. The activity types will help you in thinking through how best to design and deliver high-impact learning experiences for your students in a typical lesson. We have here some activity types. First is the interaction with content. Students are more likely to retain information presented in these ways if they are asked to interact with the material in some way. The example of learning activity here is the drill and practice, lecture, quiz, and student presentation. Next is the interaction with digital content. Students experiment with decision making and visualize the effects and or consequences in virtual environments. So, the example of learning activity here is the game and simulation. Next is the interaction with others. Peer relationships, informal support structures, and teacher-student interactions or relationships. So, the example of learning activity here is the debate, discussion, feedback, and guest speaker. Next is the problem solving and critical thinking. Presenting students with a problem, scenario, case, challenge, or design issue which they are then asked to address or deal with provides students with opportunities to think about or use knowledge and information in new and different ways. The example of learning activity here is the case study, concept mapping, and real-world projects. And last is the reflection. Reflection is the process of starts with a new thinking about what they already know and have experience in relation to the topic being explored or learned. This is followed by analysis of why the student thinks about the topic in the way they do and what assumptions or attitudes and beliefs they have about and bring to learning about the topic. The example of learning activity here is the reflection journal. So, it is important that each learning activity in the lesson must be aligned to the lesson's learning objectives. Meaningfully engage student in active, constructive, authentic, and collaborative ways, and useful where the student is able to take what they have learned from engaging with the activity and use it in another context or another purpose. So now, the third step. The third step is to plan to assist student understanding. Assessments, example, tests, papers, problem sets, performances, provide opportunities for students to demonstrate and practice the knowledge and skills articulated in the learning objectives, and for instructors to offer targeted feedback that can guide further learning. Planning for assessment allows you to find out whether your students are learning. It involves making decisions about, first, the number and type of assessment tasks that will best enable students to demonstrate learning objectives for the lesson. Example, different assessments like formative or summative. Second, the criteria and standards that will be used to make assessments judgment. For example, rubrics. Third is the student roles in the assessment process. For example, self-assessment or peer assessment. And fourth, the weighing of individual assessments tasks and the methods by which individual task judgments will be combined into a final grade for the course. Example, information about how various tasks are to be weighted and combined into an overall grade must be provided to students. And fifth is the provision of feedback. Giving feedback to students on how to improve their learning, as well as giving feedback to instructors how to refine their learning. The next step is to plan to sequence the lesson in an engaging and meaningful manner. Robert Gagne proposed a 9-step process called the events of instruction, which is useful for planning the sequence of your lesson. Using Gagne's 9 events of conjunctions with Bloom's revised taxonomy of educational objectives aids in designing engaging and meaningful instruction. The 9 steps process of Robert Gagne. First is gain attention. It is to obtain students' attention so that they will watch and listen while the instructors presents the learning content. Second, inform learning of objectives. Allow students to organize their thoughts regarding what they are about to see, hear, and or do. Third, stimulate recall of prior knowledge. So it helps students make sense of new information by relating it to something they already know or something they have already experienced. Fourth, present new content. Utilize a variety of methods including lectures, readings, activities, projects, multimedia, and others. So it is in Bloom's revised taxonomy and can be used to help sequence the lesson by helping you chunk them into levels of difficulty. Fifth, provide guidance. Advise students of strategies to aid them in learning content and of resources available. With learning guidance, the rate of learning increases before students are less likely to lose time or become frustrated by basing performance on incorrect facts or poorly understood concepts. 6. Practice. Allow students to apply knowledge and skills learned. Allow students to apply knowledge in group or individual activities. 7. Provide feedback. Provide immediate feedback of students' performance to assess and facilitate learning. The 8th is assess performance. To evaluate the effectiveness of instructional events, test to see if the expected learning outcomes had been achieved. Performance should be based on previous stated objectives. 9th, enhance retention and transfer. Allow students to apply information to personal contexts. This increases retention by personalizing information. So let's move on the 5th step. Create a realistic timeline. A list of 10 learning objectives is not realistic. So narrow down your list to the 2 or 3 key concepts, ideas, or skills you want students to learn in the lesson. Your list of prioritized learning objectives will help you make decisions on the spot and adjust your lesson plan as needed. Here are some strategies for creating a realistic timeline. First, estimate how much time each of the activities will take. Then plan some extra time for each. Second, when you prepare your lesson plan next to each activity, indicate how much time you will expect it will take. Third, plan a few minutes at the end of class to answer any remaining questions and to sum up the key points. Fourth, plan an extra activity or discussion question in case you have time left. And fifth, Be flexible. Be ready to adjust your lesson plan to students' needs and focus on what seems to be more productive rather than sticking to your original plan. The last step, or the sixth, is plan for a lesson closure. Lesson closure provides an opportunity to solidify student learning. Lesson closure is useful for both instructors and students. So let's move on to the second stage. During the lesson, you will need to present to core material to all students again and supervise group work and or monitor individual practice session for every student in class. So during the class, it is presenting your lesson plan. Letting your students know what they will be learning and doing in class will help keep them more engaged and on track. Providing a meaningful organization of the class time can help students not only remember better but also follow your presentation and understand the rationale behind the planned learning activities. You can share your lesson plan by writing a brief agenda on the whiteboard or telling students explicitly what they will be learning and doing in class. So here are the tips and techniques to facilitate an interactive lesson. Lectures are useful to convey knowledge at the basic levels of Bloom's revised taxonomy. Example, the remembering and understanding. Lectures can show how experts in a field think, how they approach questions, and how they try to solve problems. Yet, in traditional lectures, students are mostly passive and their attention span decreases significantly after 15 to 20 minutes. Traditional lecturing may not be suitable for a higher level of learning. Example, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. Research in teaching and learning show that students learn best by engaging in active learning rather than passive learning activities. It is according to Chi 2014. First, avoid text-heavy slides. Second, choose examples carefully, a relevant and concrete example. Third, use varied multimedia and technology to support your delivery. Examples, audio clips, videos, websites, demonstrations, and experiments. Fourth, create opportunities for students to discuss and peer teach each other. Fifth, use pop quizzes regularly in class. So this can be readily generated on eLearn or using other educational technologies resources. This involves students in practicing what they have just learned and receiving feedback on their level of understanding, individually as well as relative to their peers. Sixth, managing different types of students. When we say managing different types of student, it talks about student that has different characteristics inside the classroom. Example, the hostile one, the vocal or the know-it-all student, the interrupter, the silent observer, the latecomer, and last, the early leaver. So those are some strategies to deliver an effective and interactive lecture in presenting your lesson plan during the class. And now let's proceed to the last stage of lesson planning. So after the lesson, you may want to evaluate the lesson plan and think remedial methods for weak students. Replacing on how what worked and what didn't go so well will help you improve future lessons. So after the class, it is reflecting on your lesson plan. In this time, as a teacher, you take a few minutes after class to reflect on what worked well and why, and what you could have done differently. Identifying successful and less successful organization of class time and activities would make it easier to adjust to the contingencies of the classroom. If needed, you have to revise the lesson plan you've made for the better result of your expected class discussion. So for our summary, redesigning the curriculum is vital to suit multi-grade situation. So with the lesson planning, it is step-by-step guide to provide a structure for an essential learning. Further, multi-grade teachers should consider the different stages of lesson planning, which are before, during, and after the class. And that's the end of my discussion. Thank you, class, and good morning.